So now we're moving to the Northern Hemisphere, and we're going to hear from Chris Scianni from the California State Lands Commission. And with this agency, as far as I'm aware, being the first agency to implement biofouling regulations in the world. So thank you, Chris. I think that's right, Eugene. You're frowning at me.
Thanks, Sonia, and it's good to be back here at ANSPAC. Come from state government, and we don't get the opportunity to travel internationally too often. But we do interact with a lot of the regulators in the room pretty frequently and regularly. But definitely coming to a meeting like this is invaluable to us. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of our experiences and learning from the rest of you over the next couple of days, or 4 days. So I want to just set the scene first and just state that our regulations were adopted in April 2017. They went into effect on 1 October 2017, so today's the 2-year anniversary of our regulations becoming effective. I'll leave it at that. So even though they went into effect in October of 2017, only one of the provisions actually became required at that point, and that was the requirement to submit an annual vessel reporting form to us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. But the remainder of the regulations went into effect that following January, so January 1, 2018. And we phased in implementation based on vessels' dry docking schedule. So any vessel that completed a dry docking on or after January 1, 2018 is then required to comply with the rest of our regulations. And we phase it in this way because our regulations are focused on a strong, effective biofouling management plan, and the development of that plan should be taking place during the lead up to the dry dock and implemented during the dry dock. And so we thought it was a natural fit. So the regulations were adopted and implemented in 2017, but we got our legislative mandate from the California legislature 10 years before that. They amended the California Marine Invasive Species Act and basically told us that we had to develop and adopt regulations to manage the biofouling pathway after we consulted with the stakeholder advisory group and filled in some of the gaps that were existing at the time. So in 2010, we convened a stakeholder technical advisory group. A lot of the folks in this room were a part of that. Different regulators from around the world, different scientists who focus on invasion ecology, and industry representatives as well. The regulation process was informed by over 8 years of vessel reported data on the maintenance and operational histories of the vessels that came into California, and 10 years of funded and collaborative biofouling research. And so we heard from Ian this morning. His group did a lot of that for us in the early years. We also relied pretty heavily on New Zealand's work as well. And then it was a public process. So we went through 3 different public rulemaking actions. And during that, we released, I think, 10 drafts of the proposed regulations and got a lot of feedback from the greater community. So we worked specifically with that technical advisory group, but we got a lot of comments and feedback from everyone else to help shape this into something that would be both practical and protective of California's waters. You heard this already, but I think the theme is that all of us that are working on this, we have overarching goals, and the primary one is to maintain consistency with the IMO guidelines. That was goal number 1. We started this process in 2010. The guidelines were in development. So when they were adopted in 2011, then that became our template, and we worked very closely with the rest of the regulators to try to achieve that consistency. We wanted to ensure that we encourage better management of niche areas, and we wanted to ensure that we included extra attention on extended residency vessels. So during the global financial crisis and Great Recession, we started noticing a lot of these vessels that were sitting for long periods coming into California without cleaning, without managing that risk. And so that was definitely one of the things that we wanted to include in this. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but just spend the next couple of slides talking about the different components for our regulations. And like I said earlier, the driver behind all of what we're doing is trying to ensure that the vessels are thinking about how they're managing their biofouling. And so there's a requirement for them to have a biofouling management plan and a biofouling record book. They have to be consistent with the IMO guidelines. It has to be vessel specific, and it has to be current as of the most recent dry docking. Excuse me. We were explicit in requiring the vessels to indicate the lifespan, the effective lifespan, or the service life of the coating that they were using. and to describe how they would be managing their niche areas, which they're supposed to be doing anyways, but we indicated 8 specific niche areas that we wanted to ensure were there so that we can go in and enforce on if they weren't doing that. So we listed 8. We're going to look for those 8 specifically. We're going to look for others as well, but we want to make sure that there's some follow-up. And then because this was new, it is a new regulatory regime. We're now requiring them to have these management plans and record books. One of the provisions that we built in was a 60-day grace period provision because we had no idea how steep the learning curve would be. And we didn't want to start penalizing vessels for having small deficiencies early on. So the way this works is if a vessel comes in, gets inspected, we find a deficiency, our inspector will note that on the inspection report, let them know that we will be sending a letter and giving them 60 days to correct that deficiency. And so back in the office, we'll send that to the owner-operator saying, this is the deficiency. Next time you come into California after these 60 days, we're going to come back on board, check it, and if they fix that deficiency, they're compliant. I mentioned the annual vessel reporting form. We collect this 24 hours prior to the first arrival at a California port each calendar year, and it has questions about the vessel's maintenance history and operational history, and it helps. I mentioned earlier that we were collecting similar data since 2008. This builds off that 10-year data set so that we can continue to track the practices of the industry and see if there are any changes as a result of these new regulations going into place. And then we also, because we get this in advance of the first arrival of the year, we can score the answers and prioritize the inspections and boarding based on the answers that they're giving us. The biofouling management components are basically requiring best practice. So if the vessel is using an anti-fouling coating, that coating should be aged within its effective lifespan or its service life. And if they operate outside of that service life, their management plan has to describe how they would manage biofouling in the absence of having that effective coating. And like I said earlier, there were 8 specific niche areas that we required them to document how they're managing and then follow up in the record book. We do have a provision for vessels that spend more than 45 days in a single location. They have to document in their management plan how they would manage biofouling in that situation and then follow up in the record book. And then there are a couple sections at the end that are basically a part of all of our regulations that allow for alternatives and emergency exemptions. And so we basically provide the blueprint for how to go about claiming those. So those are the main requirements. Basically, the next part of this presentation is what are we seeing through these inspections? We've been inspecting now and enforcing it, and just I think a lot of this information and other information that we can talk about later would be useful for all the other potential regulators in this realm. So some of the questions we wanted to look at is how often are we issuing these 60-day grace periods, and kind of give us an idea of how steep that learning curve is. So this figure here is showing cumulative count over time, and the blue line is essentially the first biofouling arrival for any vessels that are subject to these rules. So the first arrival for any vessel subject to the biofouling regulations over time. So they went into effect in January 1. As of the end of August, we've had 629 unique vessels come into California that were required to comply with our regulations. And for context, we get about 1,800 unique ships per calendar year, so it's about a third of our fleet. The black line represents the inspections that we've conducted. You'll see that it starts August 1st. During the first 7 months of the year, we were still going through the process of training our inspectors, developing the database to be able to accept all the data that they would be collecting on the inspections. Took a little bit longer than we wanted, but we had a go-live date on August 1st. So in the 13 months since then, we've had 569 inspections that we've conducted. And that includes first-time arrival inspections and then follow-up inspections after grace periods were expired. And then this orange line represents the number of 60-day grace periods that we've issued since the 1st of August last year. So 222 times we've noticed a deficiency in the management plan or the record book, and we've given them 60 days to correct that deficiency. And pretty much the majority of those are because the vessel either didn't indicate the service life of their coating, or they didn't describe how they would manage their niche areas. And the majority of them were dry dock support strips or out-of-water support strips. So quick summary that we've had 222 of those grace periods issued for deficiencies thus far. 71 of those vessels came back and we've inspected, re-inspected, and only 3 after those re-inspections have had violations. And so it kind of gives us hope that that process of providing that 60-day grace periods to take the opportunity to do some outreach, to let them know what they're missing, how they can correct it, has been working. So we've been pretty successful in that so far. And as far as outreach, I think, so Tracy showed some of their outreach materials. We've also done the same for this page before the regulations went into effect. So all this happened in September of 2017. We provided a guidance document that basically summarizes the regulations and the requirements in plain language, so non-regulatory speak. It includes a lot of frequently asked questions that we were getting asked early on in the process. Oof, okay, thanks. And so it's available there. We had an example of biofouling management plan as well, and that was the IMarEST and IPIC template. So that's the template that we're suggesting that people use because it does include a lot of the components that we're looking for. We produced a webinar in September 2017, again, just describing the regulations and the requirements in plain language. It's there at that website. And we held customer service meetings in Northern California and Southern California to provide more outreach to the shipping agents, the local shipping agents. We also developed information sheets for our inspectors to take on board and have that outreach opportunity with the crew. I'll go through this really quickly because I'm running out of time. Okay. Just want to say that those are also available on the website, and our inspectors do go over these with every vessel that they inspect, whether they're conducting a ballast water inspection or a biofouling inspection. So just to make sure that every vessel coming into California is aware of the regulations. So after we started doing the inspections for about a year and started noticing where the industry was non-compliant or had these deficiencies, we put together another webinar in October of last year where we tried to improve clarity and explicitly say what we're looking for these requirements. This time we try to target this webinar towards the vessel's ownership groups and operations department because a lot of the feedback we were getting from our inspectors, and it's obvious, but they're having these conversations with the crew, but the crew aren't the ones that are developing the plans, so they can't really make the changes that we're requesting, and so we wanted to make sure that we're reaching that higher audience that was the ownership group. And again, that's posted on our website and on our YouTube channel. So just quickly, our next steps, outreach is an ongoing thing, so we're going to continue doing the outreach that we think is necessary, and including the inReach, continue training our inspectors and retraining the inspectors based on what we're learning. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to start really using that those annual vessel reporting forms that are submitted to us to run through and prioritize boardings based on the answers that they're giving us. Early on in the process, we had our inspectors do a base level inspection as they were getting more familiar with biofouling management plans and what they should be looking for. And so now that they're more comfortable with it, we're going to be implementing a second phase of their inspections where they can dive a little bit deeper for us. And then we are going to be working with New Zealand MPI to do some data comparisons because we have about a year and a half worth of data, each of us, to look for differences in compliance trends. Really quickly, some other lessons learned. In California, every vessel that has been subject to these requirements has had a biofouling management plan and record book, so that's a good thing for us that at least the word got out that you need to have these. There were some deficiencies with them, but at least they're there and we're making progress. We're starting to see a lot better documentation within those. Early on, because of those deficiencies and because of those grace periods that we've been issuing and the outreach that we've been doing, we've been seeing a lot more documents from the coating manufacturers specifying the application scheme, the service life for that particular vessel. So we're seeing a lot of these now. We're seeing a lot of shipyards supply their vessels with documents saying that we're shifting the dock blocks as best as we can when we're in this dry dock, so to make sure that we can coat and clean those areas. So a lot better documentation in recent months. And then the last thing, and I touched on it earlier, but it's intuitive, but it's something that I guess we needed to be reminded of, that we're dealing with a different paradigm than ballast water. We kind of have that tunnel vision where we go to do a ballast inspection, and whatever the deficiency is, it's usually the result of the crew doing something incorrectly, like doing a bad ballast water exchange in the wrong location. And so that outreach to the crew is really, really useful, because the next time they come in, they're aware of what they're supposed to be doing. With the management plans and deficiencies of the management plan, it's not necessarily the crew that has to make those changes. So we have to make sure that we're reaching the ownership groups, the operations department, early on. So as we continue moving into the future and they're starting to record things in their record book, that would be when the outreach to the actual crew would be beneficial. So just things for us to consider. And that's it.